This evening's lecture is part of an ongoing effort to reach out to the community beyond the St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary, both here in Etna and throughout North America and other parts of the world, by sharing the fruits of our teaching and research with a wider audience. We hope thereby to provide enlightenment and inspiration to all who are interested in deepening the understanding of Orthodox Christianity. I have the great honor tonight of introducing Dr. John Petropoulos, who will deliver a lecture on the famous and beloved Greek author Aesop, entitled Aesop's Marvelous Menagerie. Dr. Petropoulos is an adjunct professor at the St. Photios Seminary, where since 2017 he has taught classes in ancient philosophy, classical civilization, and the patristic reception of classical literature, and offered a faculty seminar on literary theory. After studying law at the University of Athens, Dr. Petropoulos, who was born in Greece but spent his formative years in England, where he received a secondary education, enrolled at Harvard University. A student of the renowned classical scholar and specialist in Homer, Gregory Nagy, he was awarded the A.B. in Classics summa cum laude in 1981. Thereafter, he undertook graduate studies in classics, literae humaniores to be precise, at Oxford University, where he was supervised by one of the world's most eminent Hellenists, the late Sir Kenneth Dover, and consulted also with Nigel Wilson, a renowned classicist and paleographer. During that time, he also taught ancient Greek literature at the undergraduate level. The title of his thesis, for which he was awarded the D.Phil in 1989, was A Survey of Love Motifs in Ancient and Medieval Greek Poetry, with particular reference to modern Greek folk song. Since then, Dr. Petropoulos has taught at the University of Crete, the Democratean University of Thrace, the Hellenic Open University, and a program for advanced theology in the Holy Monastery of Vatopedi on Mount Athos. He has also lectured and taught at universities in Brazil, Universidade de São Paulo, China, the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, France, Albania, the United Kingdom, Russia, the Lomonosov Moscow State University, and the United States of America, Vanderbilt University, Stanford University, the Ohio State University, University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Mississippi. He's Emeritus Professor of Ancient Greek Literature in the Department of Greek Philology at the Democratean University of Thrace, and Director Emeritus of the Center for Hellenic Studies in Greece, an academic institute which operates under the auspices of Harvard University. He supervised a number of doctoral and postdoctoral theses affiliated with Greek, Brazilian, and Chinese universities. His books include Kleos in a Minor Key, The Homeric Education of a Little Prince, published in 2011 by the Center for Hellenic Studies and Harvard University Press. He's now working on two books, St. Basil the Great and the Greeks, a case study in the reception of ancient Greek literature in the early church, in collaboration with myself, and Cabinet of Monstrosities, Essays on Monsters in Ancient Greece. He has authored more than 80 articles in his field. During the next academic year, 2024 to 2025, he will be the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation Visiting Professor at the University of Lisbon in Portugal, where he will teach courses in St. Basil's Epistle to the youth on how they might profit from reading classical literature and its literary antecedents, and in the Christian reception of classical literature. I am particularly delighted that Dr. Petropoulos agreed to participate in a newly inaugurated postdoctoral seminar here at the St. Photios Seminary, in which several of our faculty are engaged in a close reading of Clement of Alexandria. It has also been a source of tremendous edification for me that he's been with us in person for the past month, since he and I have had the singular pleasure of grappling with the sometimes complex Greek of St. Basil's Epistle to the youth. On a more personal note, in 1984, Dr. Petropoulos became acquainted with Metropolitan Chrysostomus of blessed memory, who was at the time a visiting scholar at Oxford. He later worked with His Eminence in initiating efforts that led to the first complete English-language text of the Evagetinos. His erudite scholarship has also appeared in the pages of Orthodox tradition. Since 1990, Dr. Petropoulos has served on a board of advisors for the Center for Traditionalist Orthodox Studies. In 2011, the Center awarded him the Philosophy Theological Prize, an honor conferred upon outstanding scholars in recognition of their lifelong contributions to the Orthodox community through writing, teaching, and other intellectual achievements. In a commendation accompanying the award, the trustees of the Florovsky Fund praised Dr. Petropoulos' aforementioned book on Homer as an important contribution to our understanding of the social and pedagogical traditions of Hellenism, which have so directly influenced the Eastern Christian ethos, and went on to note that few academics in our time have the breadth of knowledge, command of languages, and scholarly elan of Dr. Petropoulos, who has contributed so much to the Orthodox world, the world of classical studies, and our understanding of classical values. It is truly an immense delight for us to have such a distinguished scholar in our midst. I therefore invite Dr. Petropoulos to come to the podium.
Your Grace, Very Reverend Archimandrite Akakios, Abbot of the Monastery of St. Gregory Palamas, Very Reverend Archimandrite Petropoulos, Dean of Spots, Reverend Mothers and Fathers, dear colleagues, students, friends, animal lovers. This evening, I would like to invite you on a tour of Aesop's wondrous collection of assorted animals, a menagerie not unlike that kept at the convent of St. Elizabeth, the Grand Duchess, in Etna. The convent's menagerie is presided over by Poirot, a well-mannered parrot, and it is to him and his dedicated keepers that I dedicate this lecture. Poirot will be pleased to know that the patriarch Photios preserves in his Bibliotheca the earliest reference to a parrot in ancient Greek and Latin sources. He summarizes a report by the historian and physician Ctesias, writing around 490 BC, who saw and spoke Greek to a male Indian parakeet kept in the royal menagerie in Persia, in the Persian court. Ctesias, as quoted by St. Photios, described the bird thus, and I quote, "It has a red face and a black beard, and is blue as far as its neck, but on its shoulder it is red like cinnabar," bright vermilion. End of quote. I shall begin with an atypical Aesopic fable, atypical because it does not feature talking animals. It is in fact etiological. So, Zeus and Prometheus. Following Zeus's orders, Prometheus fashioned humans and animals, theria. When Zeus saw that the animals, ta aloga zoa, far outnumbered the humans, he ordered Prometheus to reduce the number of the animals by turning them into people. Prometheus did as he was told, and as a result, those people who were originally animals have a human form, morphein anthropon, but the souls of beasts, tas psukas theriodes. Well, I don't know what the moral of this is, but I think you can guess. Aristotle would have agreed, for in his zoological treatise, The History of Animals, he classified man as an animal, zoon or zoion. That is, a being that is endowed with life as much as a frog or an insect. The human species was, moreover, both social, uniting in society, and solitary. In his double nature, man resembled the bee, the wasp, the ant, the stork, according to Aristotle. But man stood at the top of the scale of physiological complexity and mental sophistication, followed by the elephant, the dolphin, women, and so on. As the philosopher says at the end of the first book of his very descriptive History of Animals, I quote Aristotle, "Man is the only animal capable of reasoning, logismos." A divine gift, by the way, according to Aristotle, though many other animals possess the faculty of memory and teachability in common with him. No other animal but man has the power of recollection. End of quote. Human beings, nonetheless, shared certain psychological qualities or dispositions with other animals in greater or lesser degree. Thus the philosopher states, again at the end of Book 1, and I quote, that would be text number 2 if we have it, but I'll read it. Some non-human animals are gentle, peaceful, and not violent, as the ox. Some are violent, passionate, and intractable, as the wild boar. Some are prudent and fearful, as the stag and the hare, and so on. And he goes on to enumerate various other animals, ending with the goose. He says, some are susceptible of shame and watchful as the goose, end of quote. Aristotle acknowledged the graded continuum, what he called synechia, between man and beast. Aesop went one stage further in treating non-human animals as human beings in disguise. As a colleague recently said about medieval European fables, and I quote, thinking about animals was basically a way of thinking about what it means to be human. Animals were considered to display human types of being and behavior in an especially pure, essential form, end of quote. Well, what is a fable? An ainos, to use the archaic poetic term. And by the way, the ancient word enigma, in Greek it would be enigma, is derived from ainos, and the ancients also used the term mythos of the fable. A fable is a moralizing mini-narrative in which nameless generic animals, or sometimes plants or named gods, become stand-ins for human beings. In the course of their interaction, they may converse like human beings, and that is called personification. In animal tales, one of the creatures usually will be offended, while the offender will come to grief or even end up as a meal for the offended. Pithy punchlines are characteristic of many fables, as they have come down to us. Such lines, and they're called by specialists endomythia, such lines are, as a rule, delivered by the protagonist and are often a reprimand that sums up the lesson. Fables are, in fact, a form of indirect preaching. Let's start, though, at the very beginning. Who was Aesop? Alas, we don't really know. He's a shadowy figure, yet another such figure in Greek cultural history. We can't talk about him with the same certainty with which we talk about Socrates or T.S. Eliot or A.A. Milne, the author of Winnie the Pooh. Reduced to precarious inference, historians can state, in the minimalist formulation of the late B.E. Parry, the great expert in Greek fables, and I quote, all that can be accepted as historically true in the ancient testimony about Aesop personally is this, that he came originally from Thrace, not from Phrygia, that he was at one time a slave on the island of Samos in the service of a man called Iadmon, who later freed him, that he was a contemporary of the poetess Sappho in the early 6th century, and that he was famed as a maker and teller of stories in prose, logopoios. End of quote. The facts, legends, and lore about Aesop were overlaid with rich fantasy by the 5th century BC, the time of Socrates. And this process must have carried on throughout the Hellenistic period. Between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, some of this material was incorporated in the anonymous life of Aesop, a picaresque novel written in Koine prose, which circulated when the Gospels were being composed. I shall read the opening lines from this Vita. It's called Vita G. The manuscript dates from the 10th or 11th century and is now in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. The opening lines, I quote, Aesop, our great benefactor, the storyteller, chanced to be a slave, and by birth he was a Phrygian from Phrygia in modern Turkey or Armenia. He was extremely ugly to look at, filthy, and with a big fat belly and a big fat head, snub-nosed, misshapen, dark-skinned, dwarfish, flat-footed, bandy-legged, short-armed, squint-eyed, and fat-lipped. In short, a freak of nature. What's more, there was something even worse than his physical deformity. Aesop was mute and unable to speak. End of quote. Well, he had a lot of handicaps to overcome. By the way, this portrait is a pastiche of Homer's ugly, deformed soldier Thersites in Iliad 2, Plato's snub-nosed, fat-bellied Socrates in the Symposium, and the unruly dark horse in the myth of the soul chariot in the Phaedrus, among other sources. Aesop was bought as a slave by a pompous philosopher in Samos. At length he was cured of his muteness by the goddess Isis, and in a separate epiphany was given the gift of storytelling by the 9 muses, which must have helped his career. Divine intervention did not, however, improve his looks, and when children saw him, they were apt to cry. There is something very animal-like about our hero in the novel. He humorously likens himself to a talking bird in chapter 26. One character thinks he is a baboon in chapter 11. Another comments that he has a dog's head in chapter 30. Perhaps not so strangely, Aesop empathized with dogs, pigs, and sheep. He constantly out-argued and out-foxed his owner. Although Aesop might have been crucified on his master's whim, he spoke his mind. After expertly reading a bird omen, he won his freedom in Samos. He then toured the world as a lecturing philosopher and riddle-solving advisor to kings. On a visit to Delphi, however, he denounced the corruption of the priests, and the community, was tried on trumped-up charges for theft and blasphemy, and executed. So goes the fiction of his life. Aesop was not the inventor of the genre of the fable or animal tale. Rather, he developed it somehow, or left his imprint upon it. The genre of the animal fable with a pointed message reached back to Mesopotamia some 1,500 years before his time. It derived ultimately from Near Eastern wisdom literature, and therefore was distantly related to the Hebrew masala, or parable, and the Hebrew fable, such as the tale of the fig tree, the olive, the vine, and the bramble in Numbers 9, 7 through 21, where Jotham addresses the men of Shechem. Aesop's tales were different from, say, the myths of epic. They were shorter and more humble in subject and style than, say, the glamorous myths of the Trojan War. And unlike epic, his tales usually featured talking animals, as I said. The first fable, animal fable, recorded in Greek and Western literature is the tale of the hawk and the nightingale. It occurs in the didactic poem The Works and Days, a kind of farmer's almanac in verse, attributed to Hesiod, a shepherd turned poet. Hesiod is even more of a mystery than Aesop. He was active around 700 BC, perhaps a bit later. He's been compared with another shepherd poet dating from roughly 80 years earlier, the Hebrew poet Amos, for both rail against social injustice and corrupt rulers. Hesiod introduces his fable just after warning his hearers that unless they abandon their unjust ways, Zeus will destroy them. He is addressing the venal nobles of his community and their ally, his prodigal brother, Perses, and I quote, This is Works and Days, verses 202 and following. And now I will tell a fable, Ainos, for noblemen, since they understand it themselves. Thus said the hawk to the nightingale with speckled neck, while he carried her high up among the clouds, gripped fast in his talons, and she, pierced by his crooked talons, cried pitifully. To her he spoke disdainfully, "Pathetic thing, why do you cry out? One far stronger than you now holds you fast, and you must go wherever I take you, songstress though you are. And if I please, I will make my meal of you, or let you go." He's a fool who tries to resist the stronger, for he does not win and suffers pain besides his shame. End of quote. So said, this is Hesiod continuing, so said the flying hawk, the long-winged bird. But you, Perses, his wastrel brother, you Perses, listen to justice, decay, and do not foster violence, hubris, for violence is bad for a social inferior. Notice, I hope you can, the neat polar opposites, the blatantly black and white structure typical of many later fables. On the one hand, the alpha male hawk, a big, bloodthirsty bully, proponent of the cynical rule, might makes right. And on the other, the delicate coloratura soprano nightingale, whose speckled neck recalls an elegant necklace, a bird later associated with melodious song in ancient and modern traditions. Compare John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. Hesiod's integration of the fable has puzzled many specialists to this day. What happens after the hawk speaks? Does he, like a real-life hawk, pluck his victim's feathers and eat it whole? Is the text as we have it incomplete? We really don't know. What seems certain, though, is that the poet offers the hawk's words and deeds as an example of how not to behave. Clement of Alexandria, in his Stromates, Book 5, only too aptly regards the hawk generally as a symbol of injustice. And the first part of the Works and Days is really about justice and its opposite. Hesiod, as Aesop, had the divine ability to understand the speech of animals. He understood animalese and animal body language because the Muses did, and he had been inspired by them. And this is a point to which I shall return. The disquieting meeting of Hesiod's birds reflects the ancient fable's almost standard concern with raw power and hierarchy. To paraphrase one expert, giving offense to an individual with direct influence over one's affairs could be a matter of life and death in the non-egalitarian society of the ancients. And this precariousness runs through many fables. That is why animals in many fables are locked in conflict, often unequal and deadly. According to a few Greek sources, animals and human beings alike once lived in harmony and prosperity and spoke the same language, presumably Greek. This was in the Golden Age during the reign of Kronos, Zeus's father. And this may fetch to mind Isaiah's messianic utopia of the wolf living with the lamb, Isaiah 11. Anyway, then, so the myth goes, came the fall. An embassy of animals led by the swan offended Zeus in particular, who as a punishment deprived them of articulate speech. Greek myth taught that nowadays men and animals live in a kind of Babel. Animal language is incomprehensible to men, just as barbarian speech was incomprehensible to Greeks. Only special mortals like Hesiod and Aesop could understand animal speech by divine dispensation. Their supernatural gift recalls the uncanny competence of a slave boy, which Porphyry, the 3rd century AD philosopher, reports in his book on abstinence from animal flesh. As he writes, the boy, I quote, understood everything birds said, which was all prophetic and announced what was going to happen soon thereafter. But this understanding was taken away from him. His mother, taking care that the boy should not be sent as a gift to the emperor, urinated into his ears while he was asleep. End of quote. Well, the emperor would have, drafted him as a sort of member of the military intelligence. So his mum did away with his prophetic gift. Aesop, too, was imagined to be a translator or interpreter of the language of animals. In an Attic red figure painting, and in color, yes, on the inside of a wine cup dating from around 450 BC, the fabulist with a huge head and a tiny body is conversing excitedly with Mr. Fox, who or which is facing him and looking from slightly below. Both are seated and have their mouths wide open, as if holding forth at the same time. Which of the two is the better storyteller is hard to make out. As Leslie Kirk of Berkeley University has proposed in her pioneering book on Aesop, their poses parody another famous visual scene, the meeting of Oedipus with the Sphinx. In the earliest portrayal of the meeting on a red figure cup dating from around 470 BC, the Sphinx, a composite of a woman, a lion, and a bird, has just posed her riddle, while the future king of Thebes, Oedipus, his lips gently parted, is about to deliver his answer. Both are seated, but this time the non-human interlocutor is on a higher level and looks down. Oedipus has a symmetrical classical body, unlike poor Aesop, who is more of a caricature. Oedipus himself, I suggest, is comparable with the wise Solomon, who solved the riddles put to him by the Queen of Sheba. Like Oedipus and Solomon, Aesop is something of a sophos, a sage, albeit a low-class one. In the painting, he is supernaturally able to cross the language barrier imposed by Zeus and to become something more than a mere interpreter. He becomes a Dr. Dolittle. Aesop's original muteness and his freakish appearance, remember the opening of the pseudo-biography, mark him as a speechless subhuman or even beast. As I noted, fables antedated Aesop. They were oral and were picked up by literate poets by the time of Hesiod. By the time of Aesop, the fable belonged to an archaic Ionian wisdom tradition that flowered in the northeastern Aegean, including Asia Minor, and at Athens, which was an Ionian city. Aesop drew upon this wisdom tradition. Whether he compiled his tales in writing is uncertain. Aristotle was later to recognize the persuasive function of the fable in his treatise, The Art of Rhetoric, Book 2. When you cannot find a historical precedent to cite in a deliberative speech, an address to the assembly, resort to a fable, he advised. Make one up if need be. Aristotle calls the fable a parabole, a comparison, hence the English parable. A parabole that serves as a paradigma or paradigma, a paradigm example, and works by inductive logic. When, according to his biography, Aesop was tried in Delphi, he recited before his accusers a series of fables, but to no avail. How were Aesop's fables transmitted in their earlier stages. One scholar suggested, or has suggested, that, and I quote, "the Ionian Attic Symposium was probably one of the mainstays of the oral tradition by which fables were transmitted." End of quote. So, fables in prose ascribed to Aesop circulated perhaps as a biblion, a book, in the 5th century at Athens, as we might infer from Aristophanes' birds. If such a book existed, it has not survived. I doubt it was a pop-up, though. Socrates apparently took a schoolboy's delight in talking animals. While on death row in an Athenian prison, he turned his hand, when it wasn't in chains, to versifying Aesop's fables, according to Plato's dialogue Phaedo. The peripatetic scholar Demetrius of Phaleron drew up a collection of Aesopic fables in prose, Logon Aesopeion Synagogae, about a century later, around 300, in Alexandria. This book, or books, may have been the standard edition, but it too has not survived. The earliest surviving collection of Aesopic fables is fragmentary and dates from the first half of the 1st century. So these texts are pretty much contemporary with Christ. A papyrus in the collection of the University of Manchester comes from Egypt and contains fragments of 3 fables. The 4th text is too scant to be read. One of the longer texts is part of a fable about how the owl gave the other birds good advice, which they ignored and later refused to advise them any more. This and other 3, the other 3 fables in Manchester are, I should stress, the earliest extant versions of an Aesopic fable and may be school exercises. Fables were, by the late 1st century AD, fixtures in the curriculum of elite education in the Greco-Roman world. Except for a gap of 250 years, Aesop is well represented throughout the rest of the Byzantine millennium. Aesopic fables were the first prose texts that schoolboys memorized, read aloud, copied out in penmanship class, and wrote down when they were dictated by the schoolmaster. Along with excerpts from the Iliad, they were the equivalent of our elementary school texts. At a more advanced level, fables were used for learning grammar, say in the 3rd or 4th grades. By age 14, students in Greek and Roman schools during the Roman Empire and during the Byzantine period were turning versified fables into a prose paraphrase. So they were compressing these and turning them into prose. They drew their material from the anthology of versified fables in Greek by Babrius, who was active in the 2nd half of the 1st century AD, probably in Syria. Advancing to the 11th grade, let's call it that, and the 1st year of university, as it were, students applied themselves to graded preliminary rhetorical exercises, the so-called progymnasmata, the preliminary exercises, the simplest of which included fables. A progymnasma was a written essay in which the student showed off his skill in composition. The most difficult of the progymnasmata involving fables was this. The students were given the epimyrthion, or moral of the fable, and were required to invent, in classicizing ancient Greek, not their vernacular, their own fable in prose. They had to portray characters as true to stereotypes. For instance, the beautiful peacock, the wolf, the clever fox, and so forth. This served, in effect, as an exercise in creative writing. The Latins called it inventio or inventio. Immersion in Aesop's fables introduced students or children to cynical grown-up values, but this was long before teachers were trained in educational psychology. But three fables have been ascribed to Libanius. Who was Libanius? He was the pagan professor of rhetoric who probably taught the young St. Basil, the future St. Basil the Great, in Constantinople around 350. Dating from the 4th to the 6th century, they were model exercises which were used for instruction in grammar. The teacher seems to have created his text from combining other Aesopic fables and educational versions. I shall read one of these model exercises in English. It's number 3. It's Libanius's fable, and Libanius, it may be pseudo-Libanius, but anyway, Libanius fabled 3, the jackdaw and the beauty contest. It was decided by Zeus. This is something St. Basil would have studied. It was decided by Zeus that there should be a king of the birds too. And he had Hermes invite them to a beauty contest, saying that he would give the rule over the birds to whichever one appeared the most beautiful. So the birds went about making themselves beautiful, some in springs, some in wells and marshes, and they plucked out all the feathers that did not lend them youthful beauty. But the jackdaw, for he was ugly, came up with the following trick. Gathering up all the feathers floating on the water, he stuck them on himself, skillfully attaching them to each other. And he became a very colourful creature. And when he arrived at the contest, the eyes of all the other birds turned toward him, and even the judge himself was struck with astonishment. Wow! So that even the whitest swan yielded before him, and the peacock and his colours gave a little, and even the solemn dignity of the eagle was disdained. When Zeus was just about to award him the prize, the royal sceptre, the owl, seeing one of her feathers on the jackdaw, came up to him and ripped it off. And each and every bird took his own. When the feathers belonging to the others were gone, the jackdaw's natural appearance was laid bare, and he was ridiculed. So ends the fable. And the Greek verb for ridiculed is egelato, which really means, literally it means he was laughed at. Aristotle would have disagreed with this, because in his History of Animals he says that man is the only animal capable of laughter and smiling. He called man a zoon gelastikon. Anyway, but this is a school exercise. Let's not get overly academic. What is the moral of this? What is the moral? Well, the teacher spells it out, and that is called the epimuthion. It's a bit cheating, but the teacher says the meaning is, I quote, "Decorating yourself by using things that are not your own brings enjoyment in the short term, but great shame when you are found out." But you know, I feel sorry for the jackdaw, which belonged to the crow family and was prized as a pet in classical Athens and as an exterminator of locusts. Notice that the wise, observant owl shows up the ugly jackdaw's pretentiousness, much like Socrates, puncturing egos and assumptions at Athens. Animals indeed can be vain and gullible, as in the fable The Fox and the Crow. I won't read that. In many ways, Byzantine rhetorical education carried on the pagan curriculum, in many ways. Okay. Not always. Nearly all church fathers who received a decent, you might call it elite education, would have been trained at school to read, parse, and paraphrase, turn into prose, Aesopic fables. And when I say parse, I mean St. Basil would be given a text, a fable, and the schoolmaster would say, anthropos, what is that? Is that a nominative, or, you know, what is that, a plural, and so forth, and so on and so forth. Or he would say, take this verb and convert it to the passive voice. So these were truly teaching matter or teaching material. St. Photios, to cite an illustrious example, rhetorically embellishes an Aesopic fable about Dionysus and the invention of wine in one of his letters. It's number 16. But in a letter to a bishop, he remarks that St. Paul is a better guide to moral teaching than Aesop. The Byzantines, especially monastics, nonetheless were fond of fables because they detected in them a similarity to Christian parables. It is not surprising that the earliest surviving manuscript of Babrius, dating from the 10th century AD and now in the British Museum, is from Mount Athos. It is Codex A of Babrius. In this and all medieval manuscript collections of fables, an epimuthion usually comes at the end, spelling out the message. This derives, as I said, from schoolroom practice. You can hear the teacher saying, well, the moral of the story is. If the ancient symposium was a powerful vehicle of transmission of fables, as noted, so was the classroom in Roman and Byzantine times. Indeed, because these stories played a prominent role in ancient and medieval education, they were subject to, and I quote an expert, the processes of alteration, imitation, and competition that increasingly undermined Aesopic authenticity. End of quote. Some of the Byzantines recast Aesopic fables or created altogether fresh ones, as we shall see. Given all the factors and imponderables involved in their transmission, it is impossible to determine which fables that have come down to us are genuinely Aesop's. Even so, I would recommend that students of ancient Greek read them in Greek and learn Greek by reading Aesop. Take the fable of the ant and the cicada. This is quite famous. Babrius gives us a version of it, and I'll read it to you. In the winter season, an ant was cold and pulled out of a cranny a morsel of grain, which he had stored up in the summer. A cicada, starving, begged him to give him some food, so that he might survive. Well, what were you doing, he, the ant, asked, over the summer? I didn't have time. I was too busy singing. The ant laughed and, withholding the grain of wheat, replied, well, dance in the winter if you played music in the summer. A version of this fable is taught in primary school in Greece in the first grade. The storyline is internationally well known. I shall rapidly give you my paraphrase and comment on the story, which reads like a Levi-Straussian exercise in contrast. The cicada perches in its nest high up in the branches of a tree. The ant resides in the roots of the tree. It is high summer. Promptly at sunrise, the ant sets to work gathering seeds, meticulously cutting the larger seeds into smaller, transportable size and carrying them on its back to his storehouse. The ant toils away every day until sunset and secures its food supply for rainy days, literally. The cicada, ever the party animal, sleeps in, waking only at midday and merrily singing the rest of the day until way past midnight. Taking little interest in meals, it grabs a bite between songs. No work, just the seemingly unending joy of singing. Then the autumn rains arrive and all the fun is spoilt. The cicada has to scrounge for food since the branches of his elevated habitat have fallen. The ant, on the other hand, has a ready supply of food that will last until spring. Well, we know the undignified end. The cicada has to entreat the prosperous ant for a morsel, only to be turned down with a brutal, brusque, ironic comment. Since you were singing throughout summer, the time has come for you to dance. Martin Luther, in a sermon on Ephesians, quoted the ant's punchline and commented, I quote, "Similarly should fools unwilling to learn the will of God be answered," end of quote. Luther translated, I think, some 13 Aesopic fables into German, so he's a link on the chain of transmission. And he used fables in his sermons. The ant's reaction is not eccentric by the standards of ancient popular morality, although compassion, forgiveness, and philanthropia were possible in pagan society. I've never ceased to be amused by this fable and to be impressed by its didactic directness and stark contrasts. The dutiful harvester, solidly attached to the earth, versus the unproductive lover of song who lives practically in the air and comes to grief. It is a transparent allegory about the work ethic of farmers, or so it seems to me. Socrates may have known a version of the tale. In the Phaedrus, he tells a tale about cicadas having forgotten to eat because of their irrepressible singing. One of my colleagues has argued that Socrates is here painting philosophers like himself in unflattering colours as useless, self-referential creatures whose theoretikos bios, or life of contemplation, lands them in sublime but potentially fatal penury. I should like to take a quick look at a few more fables in the time remaining. We have already met the bully hawk in Hesiod, a poet who has been compared with the poet Amos. Consider a fuller version of the tale preserved in a collection of versified Aesopic fables by Phaedrus in Latin. Phaedrus was a former slave who flourished under Tiberius, so he was an exact contemporary of Christ. He spent his earlier life in Thrace, where Aesop, another slave, reputedly was born. A portion of his tales consists of translations of Aesop. Phaedrus was a standard author in elite education in the West from the medieval period on. So here's the tale. The Nightingale and the Hawk. A hawk, having lighted on a nightingale's nest, found some nestlings there, and when the nightingale returned, she asked the hawk to spare her young. The hawk said, "I will do as you wish, provided you will sing well for me." The nightingale was trembling with fear, but managed to sing because she must, with heavy heart. Whereupon the hawk, who was already in possession of his prey, remarked, "You didn't sing well enough," and so seizing one of her nestlings, he began to devour it. Just then a fowler approached silently from the other direction and brought down the hawk with his bird line. That's the fable. Well, I'm glad that here at least the invasive hawk got his comeuppance. In a fable in Greek dating from the 2nd century AD, a cat hosts a birthday party with sinister intent. The cat's birthday dinner. A cat, on the pretense that he was celebrating his birthday, invited some birds to dinner. He waited until all the guests were inside the house, then shut the door and proceeded to eat them one after the other. Well, you can see the feline is humanized through his birthday party. There is no dialogue here, just action, perhaps because this version is more of a paraphrase. In another fable, a cat is not only humanized but turned into a temporary Christian. The bishop cat. A cat This is German. A cat wearing, and it's medieval, it's contemporary, I think, with Martin Luther, and you'll be able to see why. A cat wearing a mitre and leaning on a sceptre called the mice together and, declaring that he was a bishop, ordered them to bow before him and be obedient to him. An old mouse spoke up and said to him, "I'd rather die a pagan than become a Christian and be under your power." Then all the mice fled from his benediction and hid themselves in their holes, and the cat, taking off his mitre, put aside his episcopacy. Aesop could be recycled and put to anti-clerical use not only in the West, but also in the Orthodox East. Once again, the cat, this time a female cat, is the villain. Here's the tale recounted by the Byzantine historian Nicephorus Gregoras, who has been described as one of the most versatile scholars in the 14th century. The black cat. A shoemaker kept a white cat in his house that caught a mouse every day. One day the cat fell into a pot of blacking, black polish, and came out black all over. The mice reckoned that the cat could no longer be carnivorous now that she had taken on the aspect of a monk, and so they spread themselves fearlessly all over the place. On finding such an abundance of prey, the cat would have liked to seize them all at once, but it was impossible. As it was, she caught 2 mice and devoured them. All the others ran away, wondering why it was that the cat had become even more savage after donning the habit of a monk. That is interesting. That is a rhetorical question. Human beings, heroes, and gods sometimes feature in Aesopic fables. Socrates reportedly devised a fable in which Aesop was the main character. Now, some members of the audience, let's call them members of the lupine lobby, complain that wolves get a bad press, whereas they really are not as bad as we think. Aesop, not to mention the Gospel of St. John, has had a hand in perpetuating the one-sided stereotype of the conniving, dangerous, hungry wolf, I'm afraid. There is an unusually high number of fables about wolves, and nearly all cast this beast in a criminal light. Before Aesop, Homer portrayed wolves as hungry killers. Greek myths about lycanthropy, i.e. turning into a werewolf, seem to acknowledge their intelligence and to assume a continuum between men and wolves, which explains the ease with which men supposedly can slide into becoming wolves and back. That's the interesting thing. But Aesop seems also to have tempered, I'm happy to report, he tempered the negative image in at least 3 tales. Plutarch, a writer of the early and mid-2nd century AD, whom the Church Fathers read, preserves this Aesopic tale. The Wolf and the Shepherds. Aesop told a story to this effect, that a wolf, on seeing some shepherds eating a lamb in their tent, came near and said, "What a fuss you'd make if I were doing this." The wolf converses with men and shows up their hypocrisy. They can be as hungry as a wolf and kill and eat a lamb. Like Socrates, he challenges the double standard. Next, consider a fable in iambics by Ignatius, the deacon, a pupil of the patriarch Tarasius in the late 8th century. Before I read it, I must note that Lycophron, who is mentioned, was a 3rd century BC poet who wrote the Alexandra, a massive, sprawling poem that was notoriously obscure, the equivalent, say, of James Joyce's Ulysses. So here goes the fable. A wolf, in Greek lukos or likos, looked into the poetry of Lycophron and hastened to a bird for the purpose of telling him about it. But when the bird saw the foolish student of Lycophron with his mouth wide open, he took to flight in a hurry. We have a pun, of course. Lykos or Lycos and Lycophron, Lycophron. The wolf also has an intellectual side, but alas, he is a victim of a racial stereotype. He wants to share his reading experience with the bird, but his physiognomy scares the bird away. But here is another fable that is still more favorable to wolves. The plump dog. A very plump dog met a wolf who questioned him, asking him where he was raised, becoming so large and fat a dog. A generous man, he said, feeds me. But your neck, the wolf said, how did it become bare? It's rubbed by the iron collar that my keeper forged and put on me, said the dog. The wolf laughed at him, saying, well, for my part, I say no to this luxury, for the sake of which iron would rub my neck. This is a choice fable in which a character evaluates two choices, two options. The city mouse and the country mouse, right? Well, as you can see, Aesop was a teller of tales for all ages and eras, not only for children, but also for grown-ups, and not only in antiquity, but also during the Christian Middle Ages and beyond. I think he's made his way into a Disney film or two. The fables show the enduring reception of ancient Greek culture through literate routes and byways, especially education. We still refer to Aesop, often unawares, whenever we use phrases like the lion's share, cakes and ale, the goose that lays the golden egg, dog in the manger, sour grapes, crying wolf, look before you leap, and so on. It is a shame, of course, that his fables have given cats and wolves, in particular, a dubious reputation. But Aesop is not the only one to blame. And as any cat or wolf might tell you, all of Aesop's creatures, whether good or bad, are really disguises for the strengths and weaknesses, the successes and failings of human animals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. John. That was quite wonderful. How far back can we trace the illustrations of Aesop's fables? And who was one of the most famous or well-known illustrators of these tales?
Well, actually, our library has an example. And especially in Victorian England, we have a lot of illustrators of the fables. But I would, this Caxton's fables illustrated by Miller Parker, for instance, and these are beautiful. These are actually wood prints. I think the heyday of illustration is this is from our library. The heyday was the Victorian period, but we do have illustrations in Renaissance Europe. The Bishop Cat, remember? We have drawings and little, cartoon-like illustrations. But it's a rarefied subject, but it's quite interesting. Certainly children's books, especially from the 19th century, have a lot of beautiful, handsome paintings and drawings. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor, for the wonderful talk. You mentioned that the wolves and the cats had a bad rep in Aesop. Who were the most noble creatures?
That's a good question. I think Aesop has, well, whoever Aesop were or was, most of his animals have a bad side, I think. The frog can be a quack as in a doctor, quack. The wolf comes out quite good in this, the last fable I cited. The lion you'd think is noble, regal, and all that, and brave, but he too can attack sheep. So really not taken made a record, kept a record or tally, but I would think that the locust, the very insects tend to be, well, certain insects like the locust, the cicada, they're portrayed as being very meek and humble and at the mercy of a bully. Cats, no. Vipers, no. There is a serpent, a fable about a serpent, which portrays it in a favorable light.
I would have thought the lion would be
The lion does have, it has its moments, but it can be also very wild.
Thank you, Dr. John, very much. I have, I think, two questions. The first, in the collection of Aesop's fables, they seem to all have some moral theme.
Mm-hmm.
Were they ever used for social and political commentary?
Yes.
Criticism of rulers, for example.
Yes. That is a vast subject, but because it's indirect preaching, many of these fables, the very ancient ones, seem to have been relevant to contemporary politics. We know that Phaedrus, for instance, contemporary of Christ, a Greek slave or former slave who composed in Latin verse, basing himself largely on Aesop, he created a number of fables which were social and political commentary. So, yes. So, you see, Aesop lent himself to this sort of fantasized persona of Aesop as a sort of insurgent outsider. So you could use Aesop to serve a political message, an anti-clerical message, which is also social.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can see that, yes.
I think the parable of the cat bishop
Mm-hmm.
and Grigoras were very pointed in their commentary on the clerical ranks.
Right. And as I said, Aristotle recognizes the possibility of using something in a political speech. That's what a deliberative speech is. So he said, just invent something. If you can't cite the Battle of Marathon, doesn't quite fit the situation. Just invent something, or dip into your Aesop. You see, into the animal fables. Yeah, it's quite an armament, you might say.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Dr. John. I enjoyed it very much, and I particularly liked the cat bishop. That was my I love that one. Put aside his episcopacy.
Put it down to Martin Luther.
Well, I actually have a question pertaining to that, because it seems that Aesop's Fables is, very famous both in ancient Greece, and then it spreads, I'm assuming because of the Renaissance, throughout Europe. Are they famous anywhere else? Like, did their influence spread in the Middle East or in South?
They sprang from what we call the Middle East, that part of the world, and they're very much at home in a tradition which actually is the substratum, the underlayer of the life of Aesop. It's an Aramaic tradition. I'm not a specialist, of course, but it can be traced to the 5th century BC. A vizier, or a vizier, an advisor to the kings of Assyria called Ahikar, was a sort of a wise man who was hounded, but also dealt with situations very deftly by resorting to riddles and fables. So it's a Middle East genre, you might say, if you go way back, to ancient Sumeria. And there are actually Japanese versions of Aesop. But how did Aesop reach Japan in the 19th century? Portuguese, and even earlier, before the 19th century, Portuguese missionaries taught Portuguese using Aesop, you see. So there are books of Aesop's fables that go back to that period.
Wow, that's fascinating. Because I did have a small, short follow-up question pertaining to that, and that was, were there any other fabled poets or writers that are similar to Aesop from the ancient period? You know, around that time period that Aesop was, but you know, that aren't in ancient Greece.
It was Aesop, and it's such a pity we can't say George Anthony Aesop, you know, put him on a map or whatever. But Aesop seems to have absorbed this underground tradition, and to have somehow dignified it. But it's basically Aesop, and then you might say his imitators, like Babrius and Phaedrus, and then schoolmasters who, in the Roman period, had bilingual books, school books, Latin versions of Aesop. So, but you can't say that in antiquity there were many Aesops, literally, no. But then you get writers, littérateurs, as they're called, like Jean de La Fontaine, in the court of Louis XIV, Louis XIV, I think, who versified. He really turned Aesop into a sublime medium. So you have his imitators, but not, as far as I know, in antiquity. No. Yeah. Everyone would say, well, this is an Aesopian or Aesopic fable. See. That gave it some seal of approval.
Thank you very
much. Prestige. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you for answering my question.
Dr. John, you had shared that, Saint Basil the Great, for example, would have studied using Aesop's fables, yes, and that the church fathers were very familiar. Do we have an anthology how often are there direct references to or sort of hints, because the fathers knew that whoever was going to be reading their work had a similar background in them? Are there a lot of common references to Aesop's fables in the writings of the church fathers?
I would imagine, yes. I would imagine.
But these have not been, nobody's ever gone through.
You've outlined a project for, a research project to be funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Seriously, Aesop in Byzantium, in the church fathers. And I would wager money that you'll find him being used. I would assume that later Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain used him or was aware of him. I don't know. If we go back to school texts of the Ottoman period, we'll find Aesop, I'm sure. Yeah. But very important. I think it's because let's call them the medieval Greeks, were interested in hidden meaning.
Okay.
So that would have appealed to them.
Hello, Dr. John.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your lecture. When you were speaking of the idea, at least, I'm not sure how true it was, that there were certain unique people, like that young boy that got his talent taken away in a gruesome manner, and Aesop, that could understand the dialogue of animals. Does that in any way, whether subconsciously or consciously, or does it in the future, through the church fathers, connect in any way with how man was before the fall? Because I understand from what I've been told that before the fall, man had a much better relationship with the animals.
The Greeks thought so, certainly. There are Greek myths which say that man and animal, man and beast, communicated in the same tongue, the same language. And you see that also in, again, I'm straying out of my area. In Jubilees, chapter 3, animals and human beings spoke the same language until the fall. Then animals were denied speech. So there is this notion that man and animal spoke, intercommunicated. But man is the only animal, according to Aristotle, who can think of the divine, has a notion of the divine. I'm perhaps not answering your question, but Aristotle says so, Xenophon says so, and so forth. So there is a notion that there are people who can go back to this primeval language spoken by animals before the fall, perhaps. But it's really by the grace of the gods in ancient Greece that this can happen. And it may be because these animal, these Dr. Doolittles, well, let's not call them that, these interpreters of bird language were originally ritual authorities or priests who could interpret the flight of birds and bird cries. It was a divine gift, you see. So perhaps, many layers or many stages behind Aesop lies a ritual authority, that notion, that ideology of a ritual authority, a priest. And we have evidence in Mesopotamia of ritual authorities, diviners who can read bird signs and actually interpret bird calls. So it has to do with that, I think.
Okay.
At many removes, countless removes, you see.
Muito obrigado pela palestra, doutor. My
Prazer.
My question is, you mentioned the word parable, parabole, and it seems that the meanings of fables and parable are kind of related. I was just wondering if the Jews at the time of Jesus, when he started preaching parables, they recognized this kind of way of talking and using animals, or Christ didn't use animals. Actually, he used animals too. But he, this kind of language to get to the point, because came to my mind, for example, the prophet David in the Psalms, he used animals, not giving the personification of an animal, but he uses the animal to get to the point. For example, in Psalm 103, he says that the lion goes to his den so the man can go out and work. So do you think they would recognize this kind of usage of analogies for animals and other kinds of?
Do you mean the Jesus's audience?
Yeah, exactly.
Would they have?
They had
Well,
this
I don't
reference
think
before Christ using
Well,
it.
I mean, the Aesopic fable or Ainos is distantly related to the. I don't know how to pronounce it. Masalach. What is it? The parable. It's well in the sense that it is a parable. But I don't think that in the time of Christ, his hearers, his audience, would have considered his parables as Aesopic, or they're just parallel species, let's call them that, or genre. That's what I would say. It's indirect preaching, and it's driving a point very delicately. So you're not really driving it; you're making a point through induction. That's what a parable does. But it has nothing to do, genealogically speaking, with Aesop. No. And it's interesting that the Bible has no cats.
Isn't it sad?
No cats.
And yet there are
I've
many.
searched for cats, no cat. I mean, in the Bible. Yes.
Typically, there are many cats found in monasteries, though.
Ah, yes.
So I don't know what the.
There are, yes, but no cats. It's interesting, you said, Pedro, that yes, Christ uses animal imagery or terms. He compares himself to a hen, doesn't he? And, birds and so forth. But no, they're not Aesopic by any stretch of the imagination. But they belong to a wisdom tradition, you see, that reaches back, I dare say, back to about 2000 BC in Samaria, you see. So Christ is using something that is a well-honed, established tool. And it's certainly a Jewish tool, Judaic tool.
In the wisdom tradition of the Far East, for example, of China, that also has a very, very rich history and culture. Are there not contemporaries, but similar type of fables?
I should imagine, yes. But a little in between, in India, there's the Panchatantra, I think it's called, 2nd century, I think, AD, animal tales, which have been used by Westerners, including Jean de La Fontaine, believe it or not. He relied on Indic material.
And then the Jungle Book, of course, by...
Jungle Book, yes, yes. And I mentioned the Prometheus myth. Remember at the very beginning I said it's etiological. What is an etiological fable? It is a just so story. You resort to a story to explain something that exists now, you see. Why does the leopard have spots, right? Or so on.
So, Dr. John, I'm equating some of these animal references to symbolic animal references in iconography. So we have animal representations for the evangelists. We have animal examples, peacocks, pelicans and their qualities. So do you think that this was influenced? Is it a direct influence in some way? Since it predates these symbols?
Well, some symbols are quite commonplace. The very vain exhibitionist peacock, for instance, and it's imbued with a different meaning in Christianity, isn't it? So it really has to do with man's relation to the natural world, to the animal world. But so, the lion is regal, and he gets good press in
C.S. Lewis
Greek
gives him good
literature,
press.
certainly in Greek art, yes. But the wolf, no. I mean, I have come across a lot of stories, ancient stories of visitors or tourists, as it were, being attacked by and eaten up by wolves. But you get a good wolf, a she-wolf, in the ideology of Rome, right? Remus and Romulus, right? The twins who suckled on a she-wolf, you see. And a she-wolf is associated with the god Mars, the god of war. So it's a bit complicated. Yeah, you have to trace these various things.
No.
But I'm sure that Aesop had his hand in some things. Yes.
Please join me in giving Dr. John a big round of applause.
Thank you. It was a privilege and a blessing to come here. So thank you.